But what we want to do is kind of summarize and synthesize everything we've got about Dionysius. Because he's a leading figure, not necessarily so much for himself, but for the influence of his ideas, some often indirect. Yeah?
Can you first explain why on earth he's called a Pseudo-Areopagite?
Yes, I'm planning to do that right now, in fact. Okay, Dionysius is mentioned in the New Testament in Acts 17:34. He is said to have been converted by Paul at Mars Hill, which is Areopagos in Greek. So Areopagos means Mars Hill. So Dionysius of Mars Hill is how he becomes known. And that is anglicized as Areopagite. Now, why he's pseudo is because people have come to believe that he's not, that this Dionysius who did the mystical stuff is not this Dionysius. So the original Dionysius was a convert of Paul. Therefore, he was viewed as a disciple of Paul. Therefore, he was viewed as having learned his mystical theology from Paul. And what Dionysius talks about is, in fact, Paul's teachings about the mystical world based on Paul's vision of the third heaven that is mentioned in Corinthians. Does everybody follow me there?
Okay.
So, he is also described in later history as being the first bishop of Athens. This is a later tradition, may well be accurate, but notice he's a pagan Greek. His name is Dionysius, which is the name of the Greek, one of the Greek gods, right? Okay, so that is the biblical figure, and that's all we know about the biblical figure. Just brief, little notes. But the assumption is that he was a disciple of Paul. Now, fast forward to somewhere between 500 and 520 AD in Syria. And we've got a person who's, most scholars think we don't know his name. It may well be that his name was Dionysius, right? Except he seems to be, Dionysius is a pagan name. If he were a Christian monk, he'd probably have a Christian name. So most modern scholars assume that Dionysius is a pseudonym that this person uses to connect himself back to Dionysius of Paul. Okay? So he claims to be the disciple of Paul, and therefore his teachings would be Paul's mystical theology, which was passed to his disciple and then written down. Now, almost everybody today agrees that this book is not written by the original Dionysius. The number one piece of evidence for this is that there's no mention of the book any time between Paul and, when it first starts appearing in the early 6th century. No quote from it, no mention of it, no nothing. Now, it's possible it had been lost in the monastery or something. And so it just pops up and appears there. The other thing is, it seems to quote, it doesn't seem to quote, it definitely quotes Neoplatonic writers Plotinus and Proclus, which implies it has to be written after Plotinus and Proclus.
Right.
Now, at the time it was first appears, however, it claims to be the writings of Dionysius, the disciple of Paul. Now, most scholars think that the author, who we'll just call him Dionysius because that's what he calls himself. But just to be aware, the confusion is whether he is this Dionysius of the book of Acts or another Dionysius. It's just like being named John, right? Is John, the author of the gospel, the same as John, the author of the book of Revelation, right? They're both named John, but are they the same John? So, you can be Fred, multiple authors named Fred of the whole works. Does that make sense? Now, most mystics accepted this as authentic Pauline mystical teaching. Okay, essentially the question arose, if mysticism is the true essence at the heart of Christianity, why is it so vaguely expressed in the New Testament? That is, we don't talk about, venerating relics or Mary, veneration of Mary. There's all these things, and they're not in the New Testament. Now, one answer was, they're allegorically included in the New Testament. That is, it's allegorically behind a lot of the verses. Another answer is, this stuff was taught orally and passed through the centuries. And now the third answer becomes, this is the mystical theology of the New Testament. written by Paul's disciples, but it really is the teachings of Paul. So it gave it a huge level of authority within mystical circles. So from this time on, it becomes a crucial work in mystical circles. Now, some guys in the Middle Ages rejected the authorship of Dionysius the Areopagite, and some guys thought it was all bogus nonsense anyway. So it's not like it's universally accepted, but in mystical circles, it is widely accepted. And more important than that, probably, is that the ideas that Dionysius espouses are transmitted indirectly to mystics. So you may have a Dionysian idea without ever having read Dionysius because you get it indirectly. We'll talk about what his ideas are in a second, but does everybody make sense of that? Now, after the 16th century, another thing that increased his status is he's equated with Saint Denis of Paris, who is the patron saint of Paris. Saint Denis is one of my favorite saints because he's a martyr saint, and when they chopped off his head, he picked it up and carried it to his church in North Paris because that's where he's buried, and they all knew he was like martyred in Troy or somewhere else, right? I can't remember who was martyred, but at any rate, the question arose: well, how did his head get to? Why is he buried here in North Paris? And the answer is, well, he picked up and walked after he died. So it's pretty cool miracle. But the church is now in North Paris. It's actually, in the old days, it was outside of the city in this village. But you go to the Church of Saint Denis in North Paris, and all of the kings are buried there. I mean, this was a big, big deal to be the patron saint of the kings of Paris. And when Dionysius gets further confused with him, that ups his status even more. You see what I'm saying? So, I mean, some people say, well, he's this Dionysius, somebody Saint Denis. Gets confusing. Different people had different ideas. Okay, the first thing to note about Dionysius's work is that it is highly Neoplatonic. It seems that he studied with Proclus, who was he's kind of the last of the pagan Neoplatonists. And as a young man, Dionysius, when I say Dionysius from now on, I mean the author of these works we're talking about. Dionysius either studied with Proclus or maybe a student of Proclus that was still hanging out in pagan circles. He also read Plotinus. He writes in Greek, so he is a Greek father. Now, he is clearly a very Christian guy. Okay, it's not like he is really a Platonist who pretends to be a Christian. He is that, but he really is a sincere Christian. What happens here is that he simply believes that Neoplatonism and Christian thought are the same. Now, in part, this is conceivable because, in fact, early Greek Christianity had imbibed all sorts of Platonic ideas through Clement, through Origen, through philosophical ways that they described the creeds and so forth. And through Philo. All of these guys thought Plato and the gospel are, and so does Augustine for that matter. They all thought they were, compatible. So Dionysius is not new there per se, but he kind of ups the ante in terms of the amount of Platonism. So you find much more strong influence on the Neoplatonic thought. And I've explained what that is, right? Everybody understands what I mean by Neoplatonic, right? Do I need to review that, or does everybody remember? Don't know? Okay. Should I review it? Okay. No, you've heard enough, huh? Okay, now to his works. He wrote a number of books, and all of these books, by the way, have been translated into a good English translation in this book here. So if you want to get it, it's readily accessible. Okay, his first book is The Divine Names. Now, in this, he believes that names of God reflect his nature and attributes. And so this is name mysticism. And we'll see this a lot in Islam, and we saw it to some extent in Jewish mysticism. But what we're doing here is essentially getting emanationism, and the different names represent a different emanation of God. Now, does everybody remember what emanationism is? It's the idea that power of God flows out from God like a light or a perfume or a spring, and that what we find is not the original source of God, but his emanations, this power that has flowed out from God. In some ways, emanationism parallels the light of Christ idea that fills the whole universe from an LDS perspective. There are some significant differences, though, but I mean, it's kind of related to that type of thing. Okay, so the names of God represent his attributes and his emanations. Now, in the New Testament, God has all sorts of names, right? Savior, and God is love, and all these different things, the Redeemer, the Father. There's lots of different names for God, right? For Dionysius, these represent real powers and forces, not just an adjectival quality or characteristic of God. They represent a real power or emanation of God. So when you say God is love, we should kind of mean, well, God, is a loving God, and he manifests love, and he models love. He loves us. Dionysius would say love is a entity, a power, almost an entity, but more like a force or a power, and it's one of the emanations of God. So that's the divine name stuff. So name mysticism is a big deal from this. Another is called the celestial hierarchies. And basically, what you have in the New Testament and the Bible is a whole bunch of stuff about angels, but it's never organized into a coherent pattern of what all these angels are and what they do and what they're named and all that type of stuff. And some of it is simply describing angels as by adjectives, like seraphim means flaming ones. So is that an angel looks like a person, like he's on fire, like he's flaming and there's light and fire around him? Or does it mean, is this a class of angels, and it's different than the other angels? Now, I think historically speaking, these terms are adjectives. But for Dionysius, they represent hierarchies and categories of angels. And this is based in part on Paul, where Paul talks about thrones, whether there be thrones and powers and principalities and dominions. He's talking about, the Roman Empire and the political structure of the universe. Dionysius changes all of those into angelic hierarchies. So there's seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, powers, onaphim or wheels. The onaphim are the wheels. These are described in Ezekiel. Ezekiel's chariot is a wheel with eyes, and so that must be an angel, right? And so you'll see in art after Dionysius, Christian art, a wheel with flame around it and wings and eyes in it. And that is a class of angel, okay? So he creates, first of all, 9 hierarchies of angels, correlating to the spheres of heaven. So he's a geocentrist. Earth is at the center, and there's spheres surrounding Earth that include the sun, the star, the moon, or sun, moons, planets, stars, the Imperium, and so forth. I mean, there's these levels, and you see this in Dante. And then each level is associated with a different type of angel. I can't remember which one's which, but cherubim, I think, is a higher angel, and so forth. So there's 9 categories. Each one has a different power, and each is essentially a different emanation of God. So it is Neoplatonizing the emanation of hierarchies and the sequence of the astral world and the categories, not characteristics of angels. And this becomes widely influential in angelology in subsequent centuries in Christianity. There were some elements of this before, too. But in later times, it even gets more and more important. And you see this popping up in Christian art quite a bit. I think I got a couple of slides that I might show you in a second. I can get you some more slides on. If you go to the Holy Sepulchre, you can see all of these different angelic categories in the dome, the Greek Orthodox dome. There's seraphs and cherubs and wheels, and archangels is another one. That's one of the categories. The archangels, I think, is the highest category. So it's not it is not a function of an angel to be the leader of the angels. It is a different type of angel. See the difference between those two? So that's this one. Now, the ecclesiastical hierarchy essentially says that the way the church is organized copies the celestial hierarchies. So you got bishops and priests and deacons and all these different things. And so the priests are on earth the celestial, they are the reflection of the celestial hierarchy of the angels in heaven. And then the mystical theology includes two important ideas: the ascent of the soul, which was, widespread, universal mystical idea. But number one, it should be through passivity. Number two, it is a negative theology, so he is big on the negative theology idea. Apophatic, right? We've explained what that is. Number three, that you ascend through contemplation and prayer, and that's, again, wasn't unique to Dionysius, but he further emphasizes it. And then all of this culminates in henosis and theosis. Now, everybody agrees about henosis, which is the idea that God, that the mystic should become one with God. What that oneness means is disputed among mystics, both in East versus West and in other ways. For Dionysius, henosis equals theosis. Now, henosis means what? Becoming one with God. And theosis means becoming a god. So does henosis imply theosis? That's the question. Dionysius says absolutely. So, but I can't remember if he comes up with the idea of the difference between essence and energy that we've already discussed. I think it might have existed before him, but he's also backing that idea. Okay? Is everybody clear on those things from Dionysius? Now, he wrote in Greek, and his books survive and were influential among Greek theologians and monks and mystics. Beginning in the early 6th century, I think it's first mentioned in around 520. Beginning then, you see Greeks start quoting from him and alluding to his ideas when not directly quoting from him. And copies of his book get spread all around. Now, there's a guy named John Scotus Areopagite, which means the guy from Scotland. He's a Scottish monk who went to France, to the court of the Carolingians, and he had studied Greek. Most Westerners had not studied Greek. He happened to have studied Greek. And he makes a translation of Dionysius from Greek into Latin. Another translation is made later. So he is, notice, if you've got all these Greek church ecclesiastical writers you could translate, he picks Dionysius, right? And it's probably because he personally was a mystically oriented guy and did that. And so you begin to see Dionysius spreading in the Latin world. You actually see indirect influence earlier in this, but more direct influence here, and then also in Scotus's own writings, there's Dionysian ideas, the indirect influence. So you see, some of it is you get that book in Latin and you read it. Some of it is you may not read the book, but you've heard the ideas in other people's writings. So that's direct and indirect influence. Now, the greatest influence comes from the 12th century when he is called the Prince of the Mystics. So he's the best of all the mystics, right? And so everybody accepts him, everybody follows him. Thomas Aquinas, for example, the greatest scholastic theologian of any time, but lived in the 13th century, quotes Dionysius 1,700 times in his works. Okay, that's one of his major sources. I mean, he quotes the Bible the most, and then maybe Aristotle, and then Dionysius, I think. I mean, I can't remember exactly what, but it is one of his top sources for his theology. Now, so you have then a broad period of time in which he is influential in both the West and the East. Now, in the East, this never really died away until I mean, it's probably still important in the East. In the West, a problem arose in the Renaissance when people began to read these other books and realize that Dionysius is quoting and influenced by writers later than Dionysius the original, Paul's disciple. And so this it was Lorenzo Valla, I think, who was a great humanist of the Renaissance, who essentially said, he looked at this and said, this book cannot be by Dionysius, the disciple of Paul, because A, B, C, D, E, and he lists the historical and textual reasons why it should be rejected. Now that decreased his influence in some ways thereafter, but at this time, mysticism was declining anyway, right? And the Protestants tended to reject this. Like I think Luther says Dionysius is a Looney Tune and shouldn't pay attention to him. So Protestants rejected monasticism, and some ways they rejected mysticism. So his influence declines after the 16th century. But he's still important, still famous. I mean, he's translated into English here, so not nearly as significant of an impact now among mystic circles as he did back then. So, for example, New Age mystics don't like Dionysius because A, he's too Christian, and B, he's got all these hierarchy things, and New Agers don't like hierarchies. New Age is very individualistic movements. And same thing with Protestants. Nobody can tell me what the angels are like because I'm going to encounter them myself, type of a thing. So anyway, that's Dionysius. Do you have questions on that? Yes?
So, we also in those Rosicrucians and people who came up with really complex graphs of stuff like this, did they just, sit down and they just kind of go, that sounds reasonable, and write it down?
Well, what you have, I mean, all of this graphic representation of mystical ideas derives from a number of different sources. One is from the icon idea, that images have mystical significance. We're going to talk about icons in just a second. Another is the medieval impulse to classify, categorize, and number everything. Another is the equation between the heavens and mystical ideas, so that you can draw pictures of the moon and the stars and the cycles of the planets and stuff, and you superimpose a mystical ideology on that. Some of it comes from visionary experiences that people have, okay? And so they make an artistic representation of their visions. But in some ways, it also derives from the fact that when printing arises, you can print and mass distribute images like that. You couldn't in the Middle Ages, right? And so the mystics start to mass distribute images of their mysticism, not just a text. Because you can make a lithograph or a woodcut or whatever and print it. Okay? So there's lots of different reasons why these, what you could call imaginal mystical diagrams start to come on the scene. I mean, there's lots of different influences on that. Anything else? Okay, we want then to look at icons next. Icons as for some reason, some of these are not working with the new system. What is an icon? Icon means image. We've talked about icons a little bit, right? But I want to explain it in greater detail. Icon means image, and in Greek, a key concept for the idea of the use of images in mysticism is that man is made in the icon of God. That's what it is in Greek. Man is made in the image of God equals man is made in the icon of God. So God himself makes an image of himself, and that is Adam and Eve, right? Now, the question, the bad side of this is that God says, thou shalt not make any graven image. Thou shalt not bow down and worship it. So, this created a problem for making Christian image. Can you make them? Are they legitimate or not? So it becomes controversial, But ultimately, the making of image becomes acceptable, and the veneration of images becomes an important part of mysticism, Christian mysticism, right? Now, the relationship of icons among people are divided into two categories. Iconodules means the servants of the icons, those who accept and venerate icons. And iconoclasts means the breakers of the icons, and those are the guys that reject them and smash them up. So within Christianity, there have been iconodule and iconoclast impulses in relationship to images. For example, the Protestant movement is iconoclastic on the whole. And you see, for example, in England, where you go to old medieval English churches, many of them have had the statues and whatnot shattered and cracked and smashed by Protestants who didn't like them. The Puritan characteristic of an empty church with blank walls, maybe a cross, that's iconoclastic idea. So, but the iconodules are the guys that want images, and that is, they'll put an image in the church and accept that as acceptable. Now, to do that, they, number one, distinguish between an idol and an icon. Idol bad, icon okay. So that's an important distinction they made. They also, the Greek Orthodox made a distinction between graven and non-graven. A graven idol is one where you take a rock or something and carve it into a shape. Two-dimensional is non-graven. A mosaic or a painting is not graven. Do you see the difference? Now, the Catholics don't keep that. In Catholic churches, you will see three-dimensional graven images, that is, statues. In Orthodox churches, you'll never see a graven image, that is, a three-dimensional statue. They are all two-dimensional, either mosaics or paintings, right? Now, that distinction is theological. That is, God has forbidden graven images, so we make two-dimensional images. Those are acceptable. God has forbidden that we bow down and worship the image, but we don't worship it, we venerate it. So there's a distinction also drawn by the iconodules between veneration and worshiping of an image. Worshiping is forbidden, veneration is okay. Now, in practical terms, there's no difference between worshiping and veneration of an image. I mean, what they do is the same. And notice that all of this is based on practices of the pagans, how pagans interacted with their sacred images. Christians continue that tradition. And part of it is probably that the pagans who convert to Christianity say, okay, I want to pray to Jesus, but I got to have an image of Jesus to pray to him. You know what I'm saying? I can't just pray to nothing. And so they conceptually thought they needed an image in the church when they prayed, and so they make an image for the pagans to kind of help them on, and then it becomes an integral part of worship. But be that as it may, what you do before an image is you kiss it, you prostrate, you bow down before it, you burn incense before it, you attribute miracles to it, you make offerings to it like flowers or ribbons, or sometimes they'll hang little pieces of metal about that big with a picture, say, of a foot on it. And that will be because somebody prayed to this icon, got their foot healed, and they hang a little thing on it. They'll sell them at the Greek Orthodox churches. Now, these are the traditional ones, right? If you go to the Greek Orthodox church in Salt Lake, I don't know if they'd have these there or not. I've actually never been inside that one.
They hang it on the icon frame?
Yeah. The icon will be like this. There's a wooden frame, and then the icon's inside it. And then on it, they'll hang ribbons, they'll hang these things, and then they'll maybe have a bar here and hang stuff on it on top of it. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Now, for both Orthodox and Catholics and Eastern Christians use two-dimensional mosaics and paintings. And these turn into fresco decorations of churches in the Western traditions. The Catholics also did statues because they weren't as theologically sophisticated or maybe theologically anal as the Greeks, and so they just, go ahead and did them. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Now, one of the ways they legitimized this was the idea that the icon, that humans are the icon of God, and therefore it's okay to make icons of God. That was one argument. The second argument is that we are not making an image of God, but we are making an image through which the energy or spirit of God can flow. So God does not reside in the icon, but his power can flow through the icon. So the icon becomes a miraculous thing. And in fact, most of the makers of icons were monks, number one. I mean, the earliest painters like Giotto and Fra Angelico and stuff in Renaissance painters were all monks. Now that changes and you get the secularization of art in late Renaissance, but in 14th century Renaissance, the great painters were all monks. Monks then produced the sacred art. Now, not necessarily all of it, but a large portion of it. For example, when you made an icon, you would fast, you would pray, you would spend days in meditation, gazing upon the icon you wanted to copy, and so on and so forth. So there were ascetic mystical practices that you did in the making of the icon. The icon then becomes a mechanism to manifest the power and spirit of God to people. Okay? Now, just as God's spirit can flow into a human being like a holy monk, it can flow into a church. The spirit can be in the church. It can be in an image. That is, God's spirit can be in anything. And so these sacred images were special conduits of miraculous power. And essentially what you're doing is making an artificial artistic relic. That is, icons and relics, which we'll discuss next time, essentially have the same fundamental capacity to be conduits of divine power. So, mystics would A, own icons, B, have private devotions associated with icons where they would set it up and pray before it. The most famous form of this in the West is the triptych, which is what? It's an icon, a collapsible icon that folds up like a book, but it opens up it's got a main panel and two side panels that fold out and in, and then you can set it up like that, and you can pray for it. It's a portable icon stand, but it's got three images in it. It's called a triptych. You'll often see them in medieval art, but you'll also see sometimes a single panel that gets separated, and all that's left of a triptych is... Diptychs are double ones. Those are the more archaic way. Okay? So you just open up two things, and then triptychs are a later version of that. Okay? So, pray before it, meditate on it, and attribute miracles to it. So there were different mystical practices associated with icons. And you do it in the church, before the image is in a church. So you kind of have a private icon. Sometimes they could be little tiny things you could put in your pocket. Sometimes, usually they're, this big. But some of them can be huge, whole paintings on a wall, and stuff like that. Okay? Does that make sense to people? Now, so in mystical practices, icons became a focus of contemplation and focusing your attention. Icons became a means of the spirit and power of God flowing out from the icon into you, and icons became a source of miraculous things. So you might stare at an icon and then have a vision from doing that, from contemplating the icon. All right? Now, iconography means the study of icons, and it refers to basically a set of symbols that are carried on throughout the artistic tradition. So an iconography of Christian icons developed very early on and basically remained static in the East until the present, and in the West became modernized and kind of disappeared in the Renaissance when art became very individualistic and much more secularized. But in the East, if you go to a store next to an Orthodox church and want to buy an icon, they'll all look just like the medieval icons. I mean, there's probably some modernization now, but basically they just continue the old tradition. And you go to a contemporary, traditional Orthodox church, and they'll have paintings on the walls that are exactly like the ones 1,000 years ago. I mean, they simply maintained that iconographic tradition since, well, probably the 6th century. Okay? Now, this is one of the earliest icons that survived. This is an icon of Christ from St. Catherine's Monastery. And it's basically, you know, if you had a bone of, well, you can't have a bone of Christ, but if, say, you had a strand of a thorn from the cross or something like that, thorn from the crown of thorns, that would be a mechanism by which divine power resides in that and can influence you. Icons do exactly the same thing. So they are artistic, man-made relics. So there's three sources of divine power. One is a church, one is a relic, one is an icon. And these are all infused and can transmit divine power. Now here are some later icons. These are wall mosaics from the Holy Sepulchre. You can see that they continue the same imagery of Jesus. This is an interesting phenomenon in that one of the arguments of the iconoclasts against icons is that you guys are making this stuff up. We don't know what Jesus looks like. You know, how can you make an image of Jesus? Well, the monastic response is, A, I've seen Jesus in a vision or something, and B, in fact, Luke painted a painting of Jesus. Luke was a painter, and you'll sometimes see images of Jesus. Good grief, only 8 minutes left. You'll see images of Jesus. I should bring you one of these, a Luke icon. They're very interesting because you'll have Jesus and Mary sitting there, and then an easel, and then Luke sitting here painting the easel, an image of the icon, and then an angel up here inspiring him. And then this is called a hierarchies, made without hands. It refers to the belief that kind of angelic, miraculous icons were made. And if you go to the Church of St. Mark's at Jerusalem, there's an image of Jesus there that they said was painted by Luke himself. I mean, that's what the lady will tell you there. But there's lots of these. Another one is the idea of the mandilion, which is the idea that there's several versions of this story. One is that the king of Ephesus wanted to become a Christian and wanted to see Jesus, and Jesus said, well, I can't come, but he took a handkerchief or something, put it on his face, and his image was miraculously imprinted there. They sent it to Edessa, and it's called the mandilion, the handkerchief. And it's got an image of Jesus preserved on that. Then the Veronica image. The Veronica note is an anagram for Vera icon, true icon. But Veronica is said to have wiped Christ's face while he was carrying the cross, and that image stuck on that. And then there is the Shroud of Turin type thing. All of these claim to be miraculous imprints of Christ's face. The result of this is that, yes, we do know what these things look like. Okay, we know what Mary looked like because Luke painted her. We know what Jesus looked like because he left an impression of his face and so forth. So it's a legitimizing of the authenticity of these things. So here you've got a very close-up, beautiful icon of Jesus there. Here's another one where Jesus sits between the king and queen of Byzantium. This is one where Mary sits with Jesus enthroned on his lap between the king and queen of Byzantium here. So all of these types of highly stylized images become what we call icons, okay? And there's a wide array of these. They can be a little stamp on a piece of metal. It can be a little teeny painting or a photograph. It can be a big one. It can be giant ones. It can be a diptych that folds out. It can be on the walls. It can be on, paintings hung or, put in a frame and hung on a wall. All sorts of different ways they use it. So there's public devotion of icons, and then there's also private mystical devotion. And mainly, icons for the mystics were a source, A, of inspiration via contemplation, and B of divine power that kind of flowed through the icon. Okay? Questions on that stuff? Sorry, I've been taking too much time here. What do we got left? 5 minutes? Oh well, what the heck, right? So we talked about McGinn chapter 8 and 9 this time. This chapter is about love and knowledge, and the idea here is that these are the twin pillars of mysticism, the love of God and the knowledge of God, and they're interrelated. That is, you can know God, you can't love God until you know Him, and you can't know God until you love Him, and that type of thing. So they're kind of intertwined aspects, probably the fundamental twin pillars of mysticism. They're based on scriptural passages, which we've explained there. And so anyway, McGinn talks about those, but the issue of knowledge proposes a problem for the mystics of negative theology. Now, you can love God without knowing what He's like, in theory, right? I mean, you just know God's there and you have this overwhelming sense of love for Him. But if God is unknowable, inherently unknowable as the negative theology proposes, then you can't know God. So why do you claim to know God? Let's just do the pure love thing. So it creates a dichotomy for some mystics between reason and emotion. That is, there is the emotional, intense love and bliss associated with mysticism and God, but then there is the idea that mysticism brings mystical knowledge, and if you can't know God, then what's your mystical knowledge? So it creates kind of a dilemma for some of the mystics. And it's never really fully resolved. And Nicholas of Cusa we only have 2 minutes left, so Nicholas of Cusa is a very interesting figure. He's a early Renaissance cardinal and theologian, also a mystic. And he basically divides mysticism into affective, which means it affects you, like affectation, but it's an emotional response. And it is the negative way. That is, you can, if you have a negative theology of God, you can still be affected by His Spirit and love Him and things like that. And the intellective is the rational, and this is the positive theology. So you get a negative, effective theology, irrational, positive theology, intellective. Okay? Now, Nicholas of Cusa says both are necessary, which implies that you got to have some level of positive theology about God, right? So that's a big thing that was important for him. The other big thing that was important for him is that he is a big proponent of the idea of deification. Here's a book on Nicholas of Cusa's deification theories. But basically, if you become one with God and you truly know God, then you have become like God, right? You become God. And how, again, what this means in the technical details differs in different deification theories or theologies. But mysticism is closely linked with henosis and theosis. And we have a chapter later in McGinn's book where he talks about deification in greater detail. So just bear that in mind. This is in part related to this distinction here. And here it is here are the technical terms. Cataphatic or cataphasis, positive, accurate things can be said about God. Apophatic, you cannot. So there's positive and negative theologies. You can or cannot accurately. There's two different aspects of it. In theory, you can know God without being able to describe Him because He's indescribable in human terms, but you can know Him mystically. The other side is you can know Him and you have to be able to say positive, true things about Him. Do you see the distinction between those two forms of knowing within theological circles? Know but cannot explain, know and you can explain, not know and not being able to explain is the negative theology. And most of the mystics would say, well, this is all a mystery. It's all approximations. You're never going to get it exactly right. And so, they'll use these as ways to model understandings of God rather than try to give you an absolute perfect 100% understanding, because that can only come through the mystical vision of God himself. Okay.